Thank you so much for joining me this morning. It's Chanuka. As you can see, I've got Menorah here, and it's very exciting that we're able to celebrate Chanuka and broadcast shiurim and share with you some of the wonderful aspects of Chanuka that are so important for us. It's such an important chag in the Jewish calendar. And I've given shiurim on Chanuka in the past, but today I want to focus on something which is it's exciting and it's interesting, and I'm going to look at it from a number of different angles. So we're going to call this shir, When is a Miracle a Miracle? And we're all very familiar with miracles. And in fact, the Rambam, and he's going to come up later on in the shir, the Rambam Maimonides spends a lot of time talking about miracles and how they occur. He's not the only one. Many people in Jewish tradition have discussed the concept of miracles. I spoke about this recently in a shir that I gave, that there is a kind of parallel universe or parallel world which God created, which is a kind of miracle world, where things can occur because they're miraculous. And in fact, Pirkei Avot, which we're studying as well on a regular basis, and you're of course welcome to tune into my Pirkei Avot shiurim on a weekly basis and hear some of the wonderful wisdom of the Tanaim of the Talmud. But the Pirkei Avot specify 10 specific miracles which were created alongside creation. And I think the concept there, and I'll talk more about it when we get to that Mishnah, is that God created miracles and he created the world to run according to the laws of physics, chemistry and biology. So we know that world very well. It's empirically provable. You can take it to a laboratory and you can scientifically say this is what's going to happen when you do this, that and the other. Miracles are a little bit more random, but don't think that that world doesn't exist. There is a world of miracles, and God created the possibility for miracles alongside creation. How we access that or when it happens is something which is an interesting discussion in and of itself, and what constitutes a miracle is an interesting discussion in and of itself. Maimonides wants to say that all miracles have some aspect of the natural world in them. And that's of course possible, and we're going to see some ideas today in today's shir which are going to take that into account, although they don't mention the Rambam. But the miracle of Chanuka. The miracle of Chanuka. Look, we have a menorah here. We're on the 6th day of Chanuka. We have a menorah, and we lit 6 lights last night, and here they are on my desk. How many days are there in Chanuka? You know the answer. There's 8 days of Chanuka. Why are there 8 days of Chanuka? Why do we light the menorah? What is the concept of Chanuka as represented by the lights of the menorah? We're going to look at the Gemara in Shabbos. The Gemara in Shabbos is Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis, and there's a whole discussion there about Chanuka. There's not a whole Masechta dedicated to Chanuka as there is, for example, to Purim. They're both rabbinic festivals, but Chanuka only has a couple of pages in the Gemara, 1 page, and scattered references here and there, etc. But essentially, Chanuka, all that we know about Chanuka comes from a few lines of the Gemara in Maseches Shabbos, Daf Chof Aleph. That's where it begins, and we're going to just read one small section of that particular Gemara, the one that refers to the miracle of Chanuka. Here we go. My Chanuka, says the Gemara. What is Chanuka all about? Says the Gemara, the Toner Rabbanon, the sages taught us, and by the way, this can be found in Megillas Tanis. Megillas Tanis is a record of all the festivals that were celebrated at the time of the Beis Hamikdash. B'chof hei b'kislev yoyme de Chanuka temonia inun. On the 25th of Kislev, the days of Chanuka are 8. Delo lemispad b'hoin udelo lehisanois b'hoin. You're not allowed to give a hesped, a eulogy, on those days, and you're not allowed to fast on those days. Can't do anything which is a mourning practice, a mourning custom, mourning custom, and you're not allowed to fast on those days. You can't declare a fast for yourself. Why? When the Greeks, the Seleucid Greeks, overran the temple, Timmu kalashemonim shebahechal. Do you know what they did? They ritually defiled all the oil in the temple, and oil was an important part of the temple duties. However, when the Hasmoneans, the Chashmonaim, the Maccabees came into the Beis Hamikdash and they were victorious against the Greeks, what did they do? Bodku v'lo motzu elo pach echad shel shemen. They searched and searched and searched throughout the area of the temple, on Temple Mount, and they were only able to find one jar of oil. And that jar of oil, that jug of oil, was sealed, and it had a hechsher. What was the hechsher? It wasn't OU in those days, and it wasn't OK, and it wasn't any of the other many hechsherim that we are familiar with. There was one hechsher that counted in the Beis Hamikdash. It was the hechsher of the Kohen Gadol, the kashrut authority, signature, imprimatur of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest. And that's what was on the oil, so they knew it was holy and they knew it was pure. However, this jug of oil only had sufficient oil inside it to light the menorah of the Beis Hamikdash, for one night. Naseh by nes, but a miracle occurred. Ve'idliku mimenu shmoina yomim, and they were able to light from this jug of oil the menorah for 8 full days. We're going to see in a little bit why 8 days matters, but 8 days was the amount of time that this oil lasted, even though it should have lasted only one. It lasted 8 times longer. Lashona acheres, the following year, kavoum va'asoum yomim tovim b'halel v'hoida'a. As a result of this incredible miracle, the following year they established a festival, which is a time when we say Hallel and a time when we pay tribute to God for having done this miracle. That's the Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Chof Aleph. If you want to know why we light menorah every year and why we light it for 8 nights, this is the reason. There was a miracle. For 8 nights the menorah stayed alight, even though it should have only remained light for 1, and therefore we light the menorah. That's the Gemara. I just want to quickly digress and look at the Maharsha, and then we're going to look at, we're going to focus on the part of the shir which is going to be most interesting. But I think that this Maharsha has something to tell us, and therefore I'm going to share it with you. The Maharsha on the Gemara in Shabbos says as follows: Timu kalashmonim, that it's an interesting point he raises. The Greeks, that when they came into the Beis Hamikdash, they defiled all the oils. And it wasn't possible for them to actually create, to either fabricate or to fetch oil that was pure, and it would have taken them 8 days. In fact, this is elsewhere in the Rishonim. Maharsha is not a Rishon, but the Rishonim say that the place where pure oil was made was a place called Tekoa. Tekoa is quite a distance from Yerushalayim if you're traveling in those days. It took 4 days to get there. They could have immediately picked up the oil, and it would take 4 days to get back. I'm not sure why it would take 4 days to get there and 4 days to get back. I'm not sure how they were traveling. But if that's the case, and they would have had only oil for 1 night, that means they would have lit the oil in the menorah for 1 night. They would have had to wait 7 days until they could get the next oil that was usable for the menorah. That means there would have been a break of 7 days. However, they immediately dispatched people to fetch oil from Tekoa, and they were able to get it. But in the interim period, they lit the menorah and it remained alight for 8 days. That's the miracle. And after the 8th day, on the 9th day, they had the oil from Tekoa, and they were able to light the menorah going forward. So says the Maharsha, they couldn't get pure oil for another 8 days. They themselves were not pure. They were Tomei. Imagine this, they're soldiers fighting against the Greek army. They killed people, which means they came into proximity with dead people, and either their colleagues or the people that they killed, whatever the case may be, and therefore they were considered Tomei. The only way they could become Tohar is if they would go through the Pora Aduma, the ashes of the Pora Aduma were sprinkled on them, but they hadn't done that yet. And that being the case, they were Tomei. So we know that the Beit Yosef writes that, and the Re'im writes that in his explanations to the Smag. Gam kosav sham kiven dehoyu kulon tamei mesim heyech hidliku hamenorah. And the Re'im asks a very good question at that point. When he explains that they were all Tomei, he asks a very pertinent question about that very first year, the time when they retook the Beis HaMikdash from the Greeks. How exactly were they able to light the menorah if they were Tomei? Because even if they had a sealed jug of oil, the moment they opened that oil and touched it, it would become Tomei. So how is it possible for them to light the menorah? What use is pure oil that was ritually pure if the moment the people who lit the menorah using that oil would touch it, it would become impure? There's no value in the purity of that oil if it becomes contaminated the moment it comes into contact with the people who are using it. They would surely contaminate, defile the oil when they would use it to light the menorah. The tirates, and the answer that's given by the Re'im in his comments on the Smag is shehidliku oisei alidei peshutai klei eitz, that they lit the menorah using a kind of tool, something that was made of wood, which wouldn't contaminate it. They never touched it directly, they only touched it indirectly, using something which they could, so they somehow managed to maneuver the oil so that it poured into the cups of the menorah, and the way they lit the menorah was such that it wouldn't become Tomei, because their contamination wouldn't go through this object that they used in order to light the menorah. The Ein Zeh Maspik. Says the Maharsha, this is not sufficient. He asks another question. He says, if it's true to say that they were all Tomei, that all the people who came into the Beis HaMikdash on that day were Tomei, were ritually impure, how could they go into the Beis HaMikdash in the first place? Forget how they lit the menorah. What were they even doing in that location? We know how strict the laws are, how strict the halacha is with regard to who can enter into the Har HaBayis, and how are they able to go into the Har HaBayis if they were ritually impure? And that's why, says the Maharsha, I cannot actually accept this theory that they were all Tamei Mesim, that they were all ritually impure. But nonetheless, there was a reason why they were not able to obtain Shemen Tohar. So the Shemen Tohar was the problem, and the problem was not, as the Re'im says in his comments on the Smag, that they themselves were ritually impure. But it's an interesting question to ponder, that at that moment when they were victorious against the Greeks, they had to take into consideration all the laws and regulations regarding how somebody is meant to be and what status he should be if he is going to perform the duties of the temple. He must be ritually pure. But now we're going to go to the meat of this shir, the most important part of this shir, and that is the question of the Beit Yosef. It's actually not the question of the Beit Yosef. It was originally raised by the Rishonim. They didn't ask the question quite as specifically as the Beit Yosef did. Rabbi Joseph Caro. Rabbi Joseph Caro was the author of the Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Joseph Caro was born in 1488. He died in 1575, and he was the author. He lived in Tzfas, and he was the author of the Shulchan Aruch, which is the definitive guide, the definitive code of Jewish law that we use to this day, on which we base ourselves in terms of how we conduct our Jewish lives in every aspect of our lives. It's in 4 separate segments, and in the segment on Orach Chaim, originally the Beit Yosef was a commentary on the Tur. The Tur was somebody who had codified Jewish law before him. The Tur is the Bal HaTurim, right? He is the son of the Rosh, and he was the first Ashkenazic codifier of Jewish law. And the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Joseph Caro, took his work and reformulated it for what he considered to be a broader audience. It was then annotated by the Ramah and became the accepted text of Jewish law, of the code of Jewish law that we use to this day. But Rabbi Joseph Caro, in his original commentary on the Tur, asks the following question. The Ikela Meidak, he said, we need to understand, Lama Kovu Shmoina Yomim. Why was Chanukah an 8-day festival? The Kivan the Shemen Shebapach Hoya Boy Kedei Lahadlik Laila Achas. The Gemara tells us that the oil that was contained in the jar, the jug that was discovered with the Kohen Gadol's seal on it, was sufficient for 1 day. The Nimtza Sheloi Nasones Hanes Elo Beshiva Leilois. In which case, on the first day, there was no miracle that occurred. The miracle only occurred for the following 7 days. In which case, if we are to commemorate the miracle of Chanukah, the miracle of Chanukah only actually occurred for 7 days. So why do we celebrate Chanukah for 8 days? That is the question of the Beit Yosef. It's always referred to, as we're going to see in a moment, as the question of Beit Yosef, and he came up himself with 3 answers, which are discussed by many others. I'm not going to go through his answers today because you'll see in a moment that what has happened is that the question of the Beit Yosef has become a focal point for all rabbinic discussions regarding Chanukah, and has generated so many answers that actually many years ago, decades ago, they came out with a sefer in which there were 100 answers to this question. A sefer which I'm going to show in a moment, which is available online, has 500 answers to this question. And more recently, I saw yesterday, there is a sefer that contains 1,000 answers to this particular question. Why we celebrate Chanukah for 8 days and not 7, because on the first day no miracle occurred. That's the question of the Beit Yosef. So the book which I want to share with you today is a book which is available online. I printed it from an online source. It's available on HebrewBooks.org, and if you're watching this right now live, we're going to get to it in a minute. If you're watching this live, you'll be able to download the book from the link which Carly is going to post in the comment section of this Zoom. You'll also see it, the download link, in the comment section on YouTube or on SoundCloud, and you will be able to download this book. It's a book that was published in, I believe, 2007. Yes, 2007. There's a Machon, it calls itself Machon Or Chodosh. I think it's a Machon. It was a group of people that got together for this specific purpose, and they published this fabulous book which contains in it 500 answers to the question of the Beit Yosef, this famous question as to why it is we celebrate 8 days of Chanukah as opposed to 7, because on the first day there was no miracle. So I'm going to read to you. I've just selected from the opening, the preface to this book, and also the introduction to this book, to this sefer, which is called Yemei Shmoina. So this is the book. It's called Yemei Shmoina, and it is all about this particular issue as to why it is we celebrate 8 days of Chanukah. Says the Yemei Shmoina. If you're looking at your source sheet, you can of course download the source sheet as well from YouTube or from SoundCloud, or it's available if you want on the comment section in Zoom. Says in the introduction to Yemei Shmoina that we're all very familiar with the question of the Beit Yosef, who the Beit Yosef was puzzled by the fact that Chazal established an 8-day festival Because we know that the actual miracle, at least according to the version that we saw in Maseches Shabbos, only took place during the 7 subsequent days after the first day that they had retaken the temple. Because we know that they had sufficient oil on the first day in order to light the menorah and for it to remain alight for one night. So what exactly was the miracle of the first day? In which case, the actual miracle that occurred, that it continued to remain alight, the menorah stayed alight for 8 full days, was something that only occurred for the last 7 days of that period, because the first day was going to remain alight in any event. But says the introduction, very flowery language, that the Rishonim already dwelt on this topic, and the Rishonim, the medieval rabbinic scholars, whose words we all rely on in order to understand our faith, they were the ones who commented on Gemara and came up with all the concepts that underpin the fundament of our faith to this day. They were already commenting on this long before the Beit Yosef, who, as we know, is considered the first Acharon, the first latter-day rabbinic scholar. Rishonim came before him, and he condensed their works all into his Beit Yosef and Shulchan Aruch, and he's considered the first Acharon. So it's not really his question, because they came up with it first. Orishon Bahem Hu Meiri, says the introduction here of the Yemei Shmoina, that the first one to come up with this question, or at least to respond to it, even if he didn't articulate it in quite the same direct and blunt way that the Beit Yosef did, but he certainly posed an answer to the question, was the Meiri, the Maseches Shabbos, Kosav B'zeh Haloshen, and he writes in his Perish of Maseches Shabbos as follows: V'layla rishon shelo hoya shom neis Hashem. What about the first night when there wasn't actually the nes, the miracle of the oil? Why do we actually make a bracha? So the bracha there is we make what nes was done on that day for us to say the bracha with a full shem u'malchus. The miracle that occurred was the fact that we were redeemed from the oppression of the Greeks, and as a thank you for the fact that we actually found the jug of oil. That in itself was a miraculous event. So it's a different form of miracle. I remember I said earlier that the Rambam says that miracles actually are all natural events. It's all about timing in this particular miracle, because the Pach Hashemim was there. They may not have found it, and the fact that they found it was something that one could consider a miracle. There's no such thing as coincidence. There's no such thing as something that just happens purely by chance. God wanted them to find it. If they had not found it, they wouldn't have been able to light the menorah. That's the implication of what the Meiri is saying. And therefore, the fact that they found it was a miraculous event. Usha'ar haleilos al neis Hashem, and the remaining 7 nights, of course, is the much more open miracle, or the miraculous miracle that the way we understand the word miracle to mean, that the oil remained alight or was able to provide the flame, even though it should surely have run out at the end of the first day. And there are those who explain that they felt that there was not enough oil. So the Arishonim will say that the oil was divided into 8 in order for them to be able to get oil from Tekoa, which I mentioned earlier. So in order for them to get that oil, they needed to divide the oil into 8, which is what they did. And Ve'ein nira li, it says the Meiri, I don't think that that's the case. I don't think that they divided the oil into 8 and that it miraculously each night lasted for a full night. We have a principle, says the Meiri, that you're not allowed to rely on miracles. You're not allowed to assume that God is going to provide a miracle for you. So at the end of the first night, perhaps they could have said, well, clearly Hashem wants this to happen, and therefore, it's the case for the next 7 nights. But the very first night, when they divided it into 8, and they made the bracha, lahadlik ha-menorah, whatever it is that they said in the Beis HaMikdash, that when they made that bracha, they couldn't have made the bracha because the bracha can only be valid, says the Meiri, if it's for a full 24 hours. And they knew that the oil that they put in the menorah was only sufficient for an 1/8 of that 24-hour period. And that being the case, they couldn't rely on a miracle, and they wouldn't have been allowed to do that. So says in the introduction to Yemei Shmoina, and similarly we see other responses to the question of the Beis Yosef in other Rishonim and other medieval rabbinic scholars. Lemasa Beis Yosef atzmai af hu hevi gimel terutzim. We know that as I mentioned earlier, the Beis Yosef himself has 3 separate answers to this puzzling question. Asher rabbim min achronim hevium, many of the achronim after him, those rabbinic scholars who came after the Beis Yosef, they mention, they cite the answers of the Beis Yosef, v'hirbu lahakshos lepalpa b'hem, and they ask many questions on them, and they talk about those answers. In other words, it became the source of a lot of rabbinic discussion. By the way, there's a very simple reason for that. There's not a lot to talk about when it comes to Chanukah in terms of halacha and rabbinic material. This is one of those topics which became almost a rabbinic sport. Everybody wanted to weigh in on this topic as to why we celebrate 8 days of Chanukah, because there's not that much to talk about when it comes to Chanukah. It's a rabbinically ordained festival. There's no Masechta, as we have with Megillah for Purim. There's nothing about Chanukah. It's a page in the Talmud, and therefore this became one of the primary topics that was discussed over the years by rabbinic scholars, because it's enjoyable, right, to think about this question and to try to come up with an answer. Okay. So I'm going to continue reading from the introduction to Yemei Shmoina. He says that he's divided, whoever it is that put this together, the Orech, the editor, or the team, they divided the answers, the 1,000 answers, into 5 separate sections, 5 chapters, he calls it. Hasefer bichlalusai mechulek lechamisha parakim. Noisim kloliyim. Why? Because he says, broadly speaking, all the answers to this question fall into 5 different categories. As you're going to see, it's not quite 5 categories, but 5 different categories. In other words, it's not 1,000 different, completely different answers. There is a category of answer, and those who answer the question broadly fall into one of those categories. So they may not say the same answer as someone else, but you can categorize them in this way. He says the first chapter, which contains however many answers, I didn't look at the number, you can look at it online. There's many, many different answers that are contained in this chapter. If you want to understand the broad concept behind this chapter, behind all the answers in this particular chapter, it is as follows. Don't imagine that on the first day that the miracle happened with the Pach HaShemen. The reason why we established the first day of Chanukah, not the final 7 days, but the first day, was because of a totally different miracle that happened in those days, either to do with the military victory or to do with the lighting itself, or to do with some other miracle that occurred in those times, and that's why the first day of Chanukah was established. The reason we have 8 days is the final 7, at least in this chapter's version of events, is to do with the Pach HaShemen, but the first day is about a totally different miracle. Ba'asoris afanim shonim, in many, many different ways, in countless different ways, we have an answer to the question of the Beis Yosef as to why it is we celebrate Chanukah on the first day, not just the final 7 days. Haperek Hasheni. The second category. Ze'ez mu la'olam hanes b'yom harishon. Ze'shmoi la'olam hanes b'yom harishon b'ribui hashemen. What is that? K'ma'asehu b'rishon k'ma'asehu b'sheni. Just as it happened on the first day, so it happened on the second day. Bo yuvu kol hatirutzim ha'mavarim b'ofanim shoni keitzad ira hanes b'ribui Hashem b'yom harishon. So the second chapter contains all the answers which, broadly speaking, say that there was a miracle with the pach hashemen, with the jug of oil, on the first day as well. You just didn't understand it from the Gemara. The Gemara wasn't as explicit as it should have been in explaining what that miracle was, but in all the answers contained in the second chapter, you'll see that actually there was a miracle with the pach hashemen on the first day of Chanukah, not just on the second, third, fourth, etc. The third chapter, Perek HaShlishi, what is it? Perek Zeh Yochil es kol sugei hatirutzim ha'mavarim b'ofanim me'ofanim shonim. So in that we see that there's many kol echad b'darko ki lemase af liyom harishon lo hayo maspik shema b'pach hanimtza. That there was no miracle as such, but on the first day there wasn't sufficient oil for whatever reason, sufficient oil in the pach. So even though the Gemara seems to indicate that there was enough oil for one day, actually there wasn't enough oil for one day. And that being the case, there was a miracle on the first day, that the oil lasted for the full day. And that's what the third chapter is about. The fact that the light remained a light for a full day was a miracle. So as you'll see in the third chapter. Haperek Haravi'i, the fourth chapter. What is it? The fourth chapter is going to explain to us why it is that Chazal established Chanukah, Limei Shmoina Daika, specifically for 8 days. That means that the number 8 is significant, not necessarily because of the Pach HaShemen, but for some other reason. B'toich Moifes Tzoif Amoreseim Mamela Tisyashev al Nochen Kushas Beit Yosef. And once you understand that 8 is an important number, you will understand why the kasha, the Beit Yosef, falls away. He is totally basing himself on the very literal interpretation of the Gemara, but actually the number 8 is significant in and of itself, and that being the case, that was why Chazal established Chanukah for 8 days and not some other number. And finally, HaPerek HaChamishi, and that Perek is Ki Boi Koivtzoi Echad leechad kol oisam tirutim asher einam nichnosim tachas echad min haprokim amvorim leel. So it's a more random chapter, and the answers there don't fit in with any of the broad categories in the first 4 chapters, and therefore they are contained in this 5th chapter. Ki metartim ish bedarka v'shitoso b'chol minei ofanim shonim. There's many different versions as to why it is the case that we celebrate Chanukah for 8 days, or how to answer the question of the Beit Yosef. Now, I've chosen a selection of answers from Yemei Shmoina. Unfortunately, this is not a book that's been translated into English, so if you're not familiar with Rabbinic Hebrew, it's going to be a little bit tough for you to go through it, but if you are familiar with it, do what I've done, which is print it off and have it spiral bound. I had it done several years ago, and every Chanukah I take it out, and I stick it there on the table with my menorahs, and I enjoy it. I look at some more answers, and it gives me tremendous satisfaction to learn rabbinic material about Chanukah. You can do the same thing. It's not expensive. Send it off to a print shop, have it spiral bound, and you can have it and you can learn it. And that's why they put it. It's available for free. Whoever it was that published it wanted us to learn Torah, wasn't so interested for us to pay for this publication, just wanted it to be available for all of us to use. But in any event, I've chosen a selection of answers. Let's look at the first chapter. The first answer I'm going to look at to the Beit Yosef's question is from the Shalah. L'tarit kushas ha-Beit Yosef nira. In order to answer the question of the Beit Yosef, it appeared to me the Chanukah shebayoi Chanukas ha-Mikdash roimes le-Chanukas ha-Olam. The rededication of the temple was in some way reminiscent of the rededication of the world, the dedication of the world. Chanukas ha'olam. Ki ha'olam nivra b'shvil ha'torah. Why was the world created? We know. The world was created in order for the Torah to be available for humanity. The kiyum mitzvah and for the Jewish nation to observe its mitzvahs. The Hayavonim rotzu levatel zois. What did the Greeks want to do? They wanted to undermine this principle of creation, which is that the world was created so the Torah could exist and people should observe its mitzvahs. And when the Chashmonaim were victorious, as a direct result of that, the true purpose of the world was able to emerge victorious as well, and therefore the world was strengthened, the universe was strengthened. And in the same way as the world, with the date of the world's initial creation, the first day of creation as mentioned in Bereshis is when? Chof Hei Elul. By the way, a very significant date. It's my birthday. Chof Hei Elul, the 25th of Elul, is my birthday. That's the day in Jewish tradition that we assign to the initial creation of the world. There was no creation. That's the moment, as you might put it, of the Big Bang, when out of nothingness, yesh me'ayin. Kach Chanuka hu b'chof hei. And that's why Chanuka has to begin on the 25th. Even though perhaps the miracle only began on the 26th, but nevertheless the number 25 is significant. Umishum kach maglikim shiva yomim. And that's why we light for the 7 latter days lezecher nes pach hashemen, in order to remember the miracle of the jug of oil, the yom noisaf, and the extra day to begin Chanuka on the 25th, leChanuka sa'olam, as a commemoration of the dedication, and in this case, the rededication of the world. That is the answer of the Shelah HaKadosh in his Sefer. Another answer here is from the Yitzib Piskam. I believe that this is from the Kloisenberger Rebbe. To answer the question of the Beis Yosef as to why it is we celebrate 8 days and not 7. Beseder HaDores, Isa Shelo Hoya Lahem Eish HaKodesh LaHakdish HaMenorah. It says in the Sefer Seder HaDores, and we see the same in the Yosipon, that there was no fire from the Mizbeach to light the menorah. Of course there wasn't. And from the location of the Mizbeach, underneath the rock, which was the foundation of the altar of the Beis HaMikdash, a fire came out, and they put wood onto the fire, and that fire suddenly took hold, and they had a fire from which to light. That was a miraculous event in and of itself, that they could light. They could use that to burn the korbanos, and of course they used it for the menorah as well. We know that the light of the menorah, that the fire that was used to light the menorah, had to come from the light of the Mizbeach Daika. As we see in the 6th perek of Talmud, if it wouldn't have been for the fact that there was light on the Mizbeach, there was fire on the Mizbeach, they would never have been able to light the menorah. As a consequence of this unusual occurrence, this miraculous bursting forth of flame from the location of the Mizbeach, that particular miracle is what we celebrate the first day of Chanuka for, and the subsequent 7 days after the miracle of the Pach HaShemen, that the oil lasted for a further 7 days. Another answer here is from a sefer called Ner Tomid. By the way, this is just a selection. There's 500 answers that you can look at in this sefer. This is just a selection. Oid yesh loima, says Sefer Ner Tomid. There's another answer, L'taretz kushas haBeis Yosef b'derech haposhut, very simply. Ma'oid. In fact, there is no question that Beis Yosef asks a question which is not puzzling at all. Because we know that the whole name Chanuka comes about as a result of the Chanuka, the dedication that happened in that time. And the the focal point of that dedication of the temple was the lighting of the menorah. That somehow signified the victory of the Chashmonaim at that moment. Gam mita'am shahaya shehi haisa rishona, the gam mita'am shehi chaviva mehakarbonos. Both because it was the first time it was lit, and because it's most beloved of all the karbonos is usually translated as sacrifices, but those things that we do as part of our temple duties for God. Kamoshe Kosov b'Medrashim, as it says in the Medrashim, she'al Chanuka zu ramzu legedola mizoi ata muchad. For greater things than this you are prepared. Im kein bevadai im hafach shemen im hapach shemen lo haya doilek b'Menorah ki im yom echad levad kefi shiurei shaya bai. Even if the Pach Hashem would only have lasted for one night, the mere fact that the menorah was being lit would have been sufficient. They would have in any event have established a day called Chanuka because of the fact that this lighting of the menorah at that moment was significant, in as much as it was a rededication, the Beis Hamikdash, using the most beloved of all the duties that were performed in the temple. V'haraya da'kovu likrois pei hanasiim, parshas hanasiim b'Chanuka zeche leChanukas hamizbeach, because the parsha of the Nasiim in Parshas Nasa is what we read on Chanuka. Why? Because it signifies this rededication of the Beis Hamikdash, and that is such a focal point of Chanuka. So the first day of Chanuka we celebrate because of the Chanukas HaBeis Hamikdash, the Chanukas HaHeichal, the Chanuka that was epitomized by the lighting of the menorah. And even if the oil would not have lasted for another 7 days, that in and of itself would have been a significant event, enough that we would have had a festival of Hanukkah for one day. Now, then the menorah continued to be light for 7 days more, and therefore we have 8 days. But the first day was because of the Chanukas HaMizbeach, Chanukas HaHeichal. Let's go to chapter 2 and look at an answer from the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer, Yesh Loima al pi ma she'omrei ba'al hanisim. In fact, we can answer the question of the Beit Yosef with that which is said in the prayer that we add in Shemona Esrei and in benching, al hanisim. What do we say? Ve'idliku neros b'chatreis kochecha. We lit the lights, or the Chashmonaim lit the lights in the chatzros, in the courtyard of your holy place. Interesting, he says. That means they didn't actually light it in the temple itself. Actually, that makes a lot of sense. There was no temple. It was destroyed. It was razed to the ground by the Greeks. And in fact, we know that the Greeks, says the Chasam Sofer, they defiled everything which was holy in the Beis Hamikdash. There was no location that they could light the menorah inside a sanctuary. Even if they would have built a temporary sanctuary, they couldn't have purified it. They need to clean out the sanctuary and to clean out and to purify ritually the Beis Hamikdash. Whatever was left, they had to rebuild it and sanctify it. And they didn't have that at that moment. Therefore, they had to light the menorah in the open air. They had to light it in the Azorah, in the courtyard, as it were, of the Beis Hamikdash. That's why it says in that tefillah of Al Hanisim and B'mei Matisyo that they lit the lights in the Chatzros Kochecha, in the courtyard of your holy place. They lit it in the chatzar and not in the heichal itself. It was destroyed. Perhaps it wasn't destroyed completely, and they could have lit it in there. But even if they could have, in physical terms, they couldn't because of the ritual defilement that had taken place in that location. The Alfizeh says the Chasam Sofer. If that's the case, Meyushav Kushias Marana Beis Yosef. The question of the Beis Yosef has been very satisfactorily answered. Lama tiknu shmoni mei Chanukah. Why do we celebrate 8 days of Chanukah? We only had sufficient oil to light the menorah for one day. Ah, says the Chasam Sofer, I have the answer for you. If you light something in the open air, it's not quite the same as lighting it indoors. We know that the wind was blowing there, and that makes the oil last for a shorter time. You would need more oil if that's the case. You need a greater quantity of oil because the flame is going to burn through the oil quicker. In a place where the wind is blowing, you need much more oil in order for it to stay alight for the same amount of time. The fact that the oil was sufficient to last for one day, what was that saying? That was only for it to be lit for one day. The quantity was sufficient for it the menorah to remain alight for one day in the heichal, indoors, inside. We know that in indoors, as it were, the wind cannot blow and therefore is not going to in any way interfere with the flame. But now that we see that the menorah was lit outdoors, and that's a place where the wind is blowing, and even so it remained alight the entire night, and therefore we can say that even on the first night a miracle occurred. Says the Chasam Sofer, that's why we have an 8-day Chanukah. Now let's look at the Chidushei Harim. Chidushei Harim says, Yeshloima, al pi ma sheyesh ledaktek lomo tiknu Chazal b'ner Chanukah mahadrin min hamahadrin. Why did Chazal, very unusually, create a situation where you could light one light for one person in each home? But if you want, each person can light in the home, and if you want, you can light either 1 through 8 or 8 through 1 if you go according to Beis Shammai. We don't have that many mitzvahs like that where mahadrin and mahadrin, the best way of performing the mitzvah, becomes the norm. Mashaloi Motzinu came b'sha'ar mitzvahs. We don't have that situation with many other or any other mitzvahs. Elo sheratzoinam hoya oz la'asois pesilois dakois. Let's explain it, he says. At that time, what did they want to do? They wanted to make thin wicks, chelek shmini meharogil, that the wicks that they put in the menorah would be 1/8 of the size, 1/8 of the width, as it were, of the regular wicks that one would put in the menorah. Kadesha yaspik lahem Hashem and leches yomim. They thought very cleverly, if the wicks are much thinner, then maybe the flame will be smaller, but at least the oil will last for 8 days until we can get the new oil from Tekoa. L'chein osu v'nase lehem nes sheha'or hoya yofeh v'godo ke'ilu hoya hapsilois avos. Do you know what? There was a miracle even on the first day. Even though they divided they cut down the size of the wick to such an extent that the flame should have been very tiny, the flame was full. It was a mahadrin min a mahadrin flame. And in that case we can see that immediately when they lit the menorah on the first day, they could perceive the miraculous event that was taking place before their eyes. And that's why, because the flames were a mahadrin and a mahadrin flame in that situation, Chazal were mesakein this concept of mahadrin and a mahadrin, of doing something in the best possible way with the Neiros Chanukah, kivun shehanes naseh behidur mitzvah, because we see that the miracle enhanced the quality of the mitzvah. I've actually highlighted a few more that I was going to look at. Perhaps I'll look at one more from this sefer, and then we're going to go to something very, very interesting. This is from, I thought I'd had something from the 5th chapter, but this is from the 4th chapter. That the days of Chanukah, this chapter was about the days of Chanukah, the number being significant, and he says that this is the Zecher Avraham. I don't know exactly who that is. He says that the reason why we have 8 days of Chanukah is to do with the 8 Nisim, the 8 miracles that occurred on Chanukah, and that's why Chazal established an 8-day festival. What are they? Only have to look at Al Nisim and Bimei Matisyo to find out. Rav Ta'es Riva. Dan to'es dinom, no kam to'es nikmasom, Mosarto giborim biyad chaloshim, rabim miyad ma'atim, tameim biyad tohirim, rishoim biyad tzadikim, and zaydim biyad oiskei seirosecho. You have 8 miracles that are mentioned in the prayer that we say for Chanukah, and as a consequence, in correlation to those 8 nisim, we have 8 days of Chanukah. I'm going to leave this sefer now, and I'm going to look at something very, very interesting, which is the story of Chaim Zelig Slonimsky. Chaim Zelig Slonimsky was a Russian scientist in the 19th century. I think we have a picture of him here, and if you're watching the video, you'll be able to see this picture perhaps more clearly. But this was Chaim Zelig Slonimsky, a very scholarly-looking man with a big beard. That's a picture of him with a yarmulke, but there's a picture of him, actually a photograph of him without a yarmulke. I think this was, in those days, if you wanted to be a scientist in the secular world, you shouldn't look too Jewish. And in those days, it was quite ordinary or normal for a person to have a beard. So he had a beard, he had also quite long hair. But he was not just a scholar of science and mathematics, he was actually a scholar of Hebrew as well. And he regularly wrote articles in Jewish journals and elsewhere. He could write fluently in Hebrew, and in 1891, he was 80 years old. He published an article titled My Chanukah, which is of course the first 2 words of the Gemara, the passage of Gemara that we read at the beginning of this year. And it was in the popular Hebrew journal Hatzafira. And quite bizarrely, Chaim Zelig Slonimsky, by the way, here's the article. Perhaps I'll attach it to the source sheet today, or I'll have it as a link on my website so you can have a look at it. This is the actual original article, a copy of it, from Hatzafira in 1891. He suggested in the article that the miracle of the oil never actually happened. And he based this on the fact that it's not mentioned in Maccabees. It's a contemporary account of the wars that took place between the Greeks and the Jews. And it's not mentioned in Josephus, who talks about the story of Chanukah, but he doesn't mention the miracle of the Menorah. And according to Slonimsky, it was the military victory that was the real miracle. The military victory was what they were celebrating, especially because it was public and widely known, while the oil miracle, if it occurred at all, which he seems to doubt, was only known by a few people at the time. Who ever knew about it? If you were living a few miles away from Yerushalayim, you wouldn't have known about the oil miracle. Only if you were living in Yerushalayim at that particular moment and went to the Mokem HaMikdash, you might have known about the miracle of the oil. But otherwise, why would you have known? That's what he says. And to prove his point, he says that the Rambam doesn't mention the miracle of the oil when he talks about Chanukah, even though he directly quotes the Gemara in Shabbos. So how did Slonimsky explain that the fact that the oil miracle was considered the real miracle of Chanukah? So he says that the Hasmoneans actually did only have 1 day's worth of oil when they rededicated the temple. And if they'd only lit that first night and then stopped for a few nights, people would have got upset. You started it, now it's not continuing. So they didn't want to upset people, but they needed to establish themselves in the Beis HaMikdash and to show that the Beis HaMikdash had been rededicated. So they lit the menorah. But they lit the menorah only for a few hours, and either they blew it out or they only had put some oil into the menorah. But of course, a few hours later, there was nobody in the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore nobody knew that the menorah had gone out. And then the next night, they lit it again. They didn't say the menorah went out. They just said they lit the menorah again, and they publicized the victory of the miracle when everybody was standing around. But when nobody was there, the menorah went out. And Slonimsky says that this version of events is very much in keeping with what the Rambam says, that there's no such thing as miracles that go against natural law. Now, as you can imagine, well, first of all, there's lots of flaws in this theory. The first flaw is that nobody would have known about the miracle. Why would nobody know? The first day it happened, somebody travels from Yerushalayim to the next place, and from that place to the next place, and from that place to the next place, and within a few days, everybody's going to know about the miracle. So of course, people would know about it. That doesn't make much sense. Secondly, we know that the menorah has to remain alight for a full day. So the next day, when they lit the menorah, people would see that the menorah was not alight, right? Because there had to be a light, and I don't know if I think it must have gone out, and then they relit it. That's the way it worked. So when people came into the Beis HaMikdash during the day, the following day, they would have seen the menorah was out. So of course it wouldn't have worked. So the whole theory doesn't make sense. In any event, the Gemara itself says that the menorah remained alight for the full 8 days, and that the festival was only established as a result of that the following year. And that being the case, by the following year, everybody would have heard about the miracle. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all of that. What I will tell you is that there were a bunch of books that were published against Zlimsky. I actually have these books, but I couldn't find them before the shir, so I've just taken printouts from HebrewBooks.org. Here's one, it's Neis Pach HaShemen. That's one book that was published against Zlimsky. And then there was this book, which is a pamphlet, Derech Emunah, which was published. I have it. I don't know where it is. I couldn't put my hands on it, but all of these are available on Hebrew Books. And then you've got this rather curious book, which is called Agodas Pach HaShemen. Agodas Pach HaShemen was written by a man called Reb Shmuel Alexandrov. Now, Reb Shmuel Alexandrov was a very, very interesting man. I'm going to show you a picture of him. He lived in Bobroisk, and Reb Shmuel Alexandrov, can you see him there? And Carly's going to put the picture in the video. Reb Shmuel Alexandrov, he was born in 1865. Unfortunately, he was murdered in the Holocaust in 1941. He was a student of a Lozhin yeshiva of the same age as Rav Kook, and he was there at the same time as Rav Kook, and he loved the Sforim of Rav Kook, and he was very much into Kabbalah and philosophy. He was a thinker, which is unusual. Most rabbis are very practical, or they do a lot of social work, and they get involved in halacha. He was very much involved in philosophy and Kabbalah, and his religious thought is, I would call it, universalistic, and in some places even antinomian. Very curious for an Orthodox rabbi to think in the way that he did, and he's stuck there in a fairly unknown place called Bobroisk, which, by the way, was a center of Chabad Hasidim. There were many, many Chabad Hasidim in Bobroisk, and he was influenced by some of the anarchistic implications of Rav Kook's work. He was very fond of Rav Kook's works, and he was also influenced by a famous Russian philosopher called Vladimir Solovyov. Unfortunately, he was murdered in the Holocaust. Anyway, he wrote this sefer in defense of Zlimsky, and he said that there's such a thing called Agoda. He bases himself more or less on what the Ramban said in his famous debate with Christiani, the Jewish convert to Christianity, who tried to undermine the Ramban in debate with quotes from Chazal. And the Ramban said to him, listen, not every Chazal has to be taken literally, unless it's halachic. Agoda is Agoda, and we don't take it literally. We take lessons from it, and it contains elements of truth. It is based on truth, but that's not the way we necessarily consider things to have happened, and that's why we can have Agadot, we can have Midrashim, which argue with each other about the same story, about the same event, because Agoda is there as a platform for us to grow as Jews and grow in our faith. And that being the case, says Rabbi Alexandrov, the story of Chanuka is also something to do with faith. It should be treated like an agoda, a medrash, as it were, of Chazal, and not taken literally. And that being the case, he says, don't criticize Zlimsky for having said what he said, because it's not important for us to believe as an element of our faith that the miracle of Chanuka happened in the way that we imagine it to have happened based on the Gemara. In any event, we have here one final sefer which I want to show you, which is Emunas Chachomim, which is a sefer which was written by someone against Alexandrov. First of all against Zlimsky, and then against Alexandrov, and that was quite a celebrated cause in the late 1890s. I have to tell you that that Zlimsky was totally unaffected by this. He felt he'd done the right thing, And he lived, I think, for another 10 years or more, and he died as a very old man, still considered fully Orthodox, and he was forgotten, which is why I remind you of him today. A historical anecdote, a vignette from history, the My Chanukah episode for us to consider. And with that, I'll leave you. Thank you so much for watching, for listening. Thank you for participating. I wish you a Chanukah Sameach, and may we celebrate with the lights, not just of the Chanukah menorah in our homes, but the light of the menorah in the rededicated Beis HaMikdash with the arrival of Mashiach Bimheira V'Yameinu Amen.